discussion. So let me begin by introducing the panel. We have with us Ms. Hannah Ryder, who is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Development Reimagined. We also have Mr. Nkosana Moyo, who is an economist and physicist and former Chief Operating Officer of the African Development Bank Group. I do believe that biographies can be found on the conference website. So let's get straight into the discussion. In Ambassador Wolf's video remarks, he makes the point that the enhanced trade integration in Africa through the AfCFTA should not mean less trade with the rest of the world. He says a two-track model is needed, substantially improving intra-African trade on the one hand and deeper involvement in global trade on the other. How can African countries individually and as a region accomplish both? Could we start with you, Hannah, and then go on to Nkosana? Hannah, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this discussion. It's wonderful, and thank you very much, David, for your introductory remarks and also for sharing the remarks of Ambassador Wolf with us as well. This is a really important question. Some of you may or may not know what my firm does, but one of the areas that we work on is trade, African trade, and in particular trade with China, Africa's trade with China. So this is an issue, a question close to my heart very much. I think I fully agree with Ambassador Wolf. I think these points are not mutually exclusive. Trying to improve regional integration, trying to improve trade does not mean that we can't also improve the exports with other development partners. At the same time, of course, we need to remember what the prize is, and it is overall economic development. And so we must really keep that in mind. And in that respect, I think one of the points that you mentioned, David, in your opening remarks was really important, which is the fact that particularly with with other exporters, with other development partners to whom we export, our trade tends to be more focused on raw materials or unprocessed materials. This is very important to take into account because that is, some of that is historic patterns, but it's also, for instance, even with fairly new trade partners, now our largest bilateral trade partners such as China, that pattern still exists. And it affects the overall balance of trade with the partners because we have to remember with trade, you can always increase trade through volume, but you can also increase it through value. So I think what we need to do in order for that strategy not to be a sort of, in a sense, a distraction, in order for trying to also at the same time increase exports to development partners, so that that's not a distraction, what we should be doing with our strategies for development partners such as China is to really focus on increasing value added trade. This will really add a lot of complementarity to our regional integration strategy, and will also support job creation. So that's my starting point, and happy to go into more detail about exactly how that could work. But that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Hannah. And indeed, I like that phrase that we should keep our eyes on the prize, which is economic development. Over to you, Nkosana. Hannah said and agreed with Ambassador Wolf that intra-African trade and Africa's trade with the rest of the world are not mutually exclusive, but complementary. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much. And yes, like Hannah, I agree with that observation. In fact, I'll put it slightly differently, and I'm going to illustrate this. If Africa opens up and it becomes easier to trade within the African continent, it's going to be much easier to attract investment. So let's look at it from an investment point of view, and I'll use Mercedes-Benz in South Africa as an example. You see, if you are able to attract global investors who are manufacturers elsewhere, to come and manufacture on the African continent, because their brands are already accepted and recognized globally, it's much easier for them to then use Africa as the starting point for selling those finished products elsewhere. And that's what Mercedes-Benz did exactly that out of South Africa. They were attracted into South Africa to assemble their vehicles in South Africa. I think the C-Class is assembled almost virtually in South Africa. But because that brand is accepted globally by Mercedes, so South Africa is not doing the selling, if you see my point. Mercedes itself is doing the exporting out of South Africa. So it actually becomes much easier for Africa to accomplish the two things. You achieve economies of scale in terms of your intra-Africa trade, because you can attract investors of scale from outside to establish. If you look at a Malawi and a Lesotho, a Swaziland, if you say to an investor, by manufacturing in Swaziland, your market is not restricted to Swaziland, it's just a base, but you can sell on the rest of the continent. Much easier for them to do that. And at the same time, much easier for them to then take their product from there and now as an African product, take it globally. So the two, in fact, complement each other.
Thank you very much for that insight, Nkosana, approaching this issue from another direction, as you said, investment and very interesting illustrations of this. Now, of course, the world is changing. Markets are becoming increasingly responsive to climate change, to factoring climate change sustainability into production and trade patterns. So now this is the new world into which the AfCFTA will be implemented. So what are your thoughts on achieving trade sustainability in this new era that we're entering? Again, Hannah, could you go first?
So I think we're in a really a very interesting transition point. I mean, just a few days ago, we had an announcement from China that it will not be financing overseas coal, and other countries have said the same previously. There are concerns about whether financing for oil and gas will continue. Foreign direct investment into oil and gas will continue, and that could be an issue in terms of manufacturing. So there are questions as to if we're talking about increasing trade. In order to increase trade, and especially added value trade, you must increase manufacturing capacity, which is what Dr. Nkosana was just talking about. How do we have green manufacturing? It's a fundamental requirement for green trade. In addition, we also need green logistics. So green manufacturing with green power. We also need green logistics. What is green logistics? We still need to establish that. On the African continent, we're behind in terms of rail, in terms of roads. So there's a lot more to do, and we've got a lot more developing to do. So this feels like a significant challenge. At the same time, we can also look at this as an opportunity. The fact that we have yet to grow and we have yet to develop the manufacturing means that if we work with those the partners that we have, such as China, and we encourage foreign direct investment to come in, which is of higher quality in terms of such as renewable energy and larger scale renewable energy for manufacturing, then that could be a means of doing that. I think that also means that we need to be we're working, the UN Economic Commission for Africa is working right now on a strategic environmental assessment of the AfCFTA. and looking at the different protocols. And even though the AfCFTA does not specifically say that environment is important, there are great opportunities to be able to take that into account without necessarily without the idea of putting development back, keeping our eye on the prize. So, for instance, the protocols on investment and competition are still open. The e-commerce protocol is still open as well, it's still to be developed and finalized. There are opportunities to create and enable extra incentives, for example, for countries that would like to be really trying to push and attract green investment, then ensuring that that the protocols are open to that, and that they have stronger incentives for the green investment rather than the brown investment could also be a useful way forward. So these are issues and questions which are being discussed, but I think we're at a very interesting transition point right now for African economies.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Hannah. And indeed, yes, there is an opportunity as the AfCFTA moves into additional negotiations of protocols such as investment that you've mentioned, but also intellectual property, commerce, competition policy, and so on, to anticipate what the market requirements going into the future would look like, and how to factor that in already. And of course, as you say, also the challenges of green logistics, renewable energy, and so on. These are also investment opportunities. I'm sure this is a point that Nkosana would agree with, given the emphasis is already put on investment. So, Nkosana, your thoughts on greening the AfCFTA as we move forward?
Well, I think the evidence of what is happening globally in terms of whether it's wildfires or floods all over the place, at least now, the evidence forces us to converge, at least in our opinion, that this is not an option. It's not an Africa issue, it's a global issue. We have to do it. The migration absolutely has to happen. So that's an important starting point. I think a second important point is that Africa is not yet heavily invested in the old technologies. Our investments actually are very thin in the old traditional, dirty, if you like, polluting technologies. So for us, the migration is also relatively painless. It's more a question of adopting technologies that have already developed in the renewables and channeling our energies and resources in that direction, as opposed to channeling them in the old. There is very little to walk away from. Unlike other countries, more developed countries, the price for them to migrate is quite heavy. For us, it's still very little. So I think we sit in a very good place in that respect. And thirdly, we are very lucky because if you look at solar energy, for instance, we are highly endowed with solar energy. When I travel, let's say, to the Northern Hemisphere, and I see how much effort is going into investing in solar energy when they hardly have the sun for most of the year, I mean, we are sitting on this resource. And again, for us, on a relative basis, it's a very easy transition to make. So we have to accept it's got to be done, not just by us, but by the whole world. So we are in good company. And then the cost for us to migrate is very low. We've got the resource in big sort of numbers or quantities to exploit. So I think we sit in a good place, and we need to be positive about it. I think lastly, what I would like to point out, though, is that Africa needs to change its mindset from wanting to own investments, in my opinion, to being able to host investments. Once an investment is made in your territory, in most cases, the investor cannot just up and say, I'm taking it away. The forms in which these investments are made, it essentially becomes your investment even if you didn't put capital into it. So my view is that we need to get smarter, attract investment and host it, rather than insisting on owning and having to mobilize the finances ourselves. Let's get smarter about this. And if we do, we can do it very easily.
Yeah, thank you also for that. Again, some very interesting insights here that the transition for African countries will be and is and will be relatively low in terms of cost, just given the starting point. Let's move on. One of the challenges, of course, of the AfCFTA is that.
David, I think Hannah wanted to say something. If
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
If you don't mind, I mean, sorry, I'm just gonna come in on a little bit further,
Yeah,
because
please, go ahead. Yes.
I did like what Dr. Nkosana was saying about.
That's Nkosana. Nkosana is fine. Nkosana is fine.
Thank you. I liked what you were saying about changing mindsets. And also, I think there's a further mindset that we also that's really important to bear in mind here. And I really think it is this idea of opportunity. If you look at Agenda 2063 and you look at there's a letter in which was written, kind of part of it. I don't know if any of you have read it. The letter to the future, right? Written to, Kwame. And it says that we see the African economy is the third largest economy in the world, right, by 2063. Now, that is quite a vision. And we know China, for example, has come up to be the largest, and in some people say the second, but others say the largest economy in the world. So if we are going to be that, we have to really, and especially if we're thinking about trade and manufacturing, if we are going to be the third largest economy in the world, how we need to be thinking about that future and what that future really looks like. And that's why I thought that letter was very interesting. Yeah. But if we're not envisioning, what does green manufacturing really look like at that point in time, then I think, we're sticking in, if we're really worried about gas, if we're really worried about oil and extractives, yes, it's really about what does that transition look like? How do we accelerate that transition to the future, to that new future? And we've been stuck in this place for a very, very long time. And how do we engage our development partners in that transition and in that vision? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges going forwards, and requires that mindset. So in addition to kind of hosting rather than ownership, I think there's that mindset of vision, and then getting our development partners also to change their mindsets too about where we're aiming for. We're really aiming high.
Yeah. Yes, I think, thanks for, referencing that letter. If I do recall, it was written by the former chairperson of the commission, Madame Zuma, to Kwame Nkrumah, of course, an imaginary kind of letter, but indeed spelling out these sorts of issues. And actually, the point you're also making, Hannah, is that even after this letter has been written, there are new issues that are emerging that still need to be looked at. And so in a sense, it's a letter that needs to be constantly updated. And that speaks to changing the mindset that we need to be on our toes, to be looking, scanning the environment for what's going on there and how best to respond to that. Let me move the conversation on to say that I think we all agree the AfCFTA is an important part of Africa's development strategy going forward. But we also need to ensure that this strategy is inclusive, that it deals with issues of inequality, that it responds to gender aspects of equality as well. And also it responds to the aspirations of Africa's youth. And I would say that if the AfCFTA is not able to do this, then we're in deep trouble, just given the demographics, of course, which speaks to the youth situation, but then also the state of inequality on the continent. Looking at Gini coefficients for any African country establishes that very, very well. So, Nkosana, let me turn to you now and to see what your thoughts are on this issue of the AfCFTA contributing to broad-based growth and equality on the continent.
Deb, if you allow me, I would like to try and approach your question slightly differently, because my view is that inclusivity should happen with or without the AfCFTA. So I don't like the attachment of the AfCFTA to inclusivity, as if inclusivity should be dependent on it. But what we can say, and I think agree on, is that the quality of that inclusivity, the quality of life on the African continent can greatly be improved if in fact the AfCFTA succeeds. And therefore the question for me is, in terms of implementation measures, what are the critical components which at a higher level create what we call an investment skin in the game? Because I think the biggest challenge that this is going to face is that some African countries, if they feel excluded, will say, you know what, I don't have to change what I've been doing. I'll continue to buy illustratively, let's say, from China, because I can buy from you, but it's going to be more expensive and I've got nothing to gain because I'm not selling to you. Now, this is where I think the big economies on the African continent need to really understand their responsibility in creating the opportunity which is inclusive for everybody. I like illustration. So I'm going to use a fantastic illustration which we've got right in front of us, the Airbus project in Europe. Why did the Airbus project succeed? The Airbus project started in the early 70s. I'm sure that both of you have been on an Airbus sometime in the last, when you could still travel before COVID. The reason why the Airbus succeeded in competition with Boeing, it's because the big economies in Europe, i.e. the British, the German, and the French economies, to just name those three, although they had national capacity to make the Airbus project a national project, they didn't do that. They made it a pan-European project by distributing the manufacture of components of the Airbus to as many European countries as possible, so that the European countries that manufactured the components of the Airbus created jobs in their own countries. And therefore, in order to gain sustainability, a virtuous circle had to be created. If jobs had to be sustained, the final product had to be bought by somebody. Who do you think bought the final product? The same people who were manufacturing the components saw virtue in buying the final product. So the European airlines, if you observe, from the time they started manufacturing the Airbus, they bought less Boeing and started buying more Airbus in order to sustain the job creation that had happened. What am I getting at? So if countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, and the like, both Pan-African basis and sub-regionally, think that this opportunity is for them to just sell other countries, then they will have missed an opportunity. The opportunity here is for these big economies to facilitate the creation of manufacturing capacity in the less industrialized countries, so that there is an opportunity for value exchange, for real value exchange. So if South Africa, for instance, promotes manufacturing in Mozambique, again, I like illustrations, it means Mozambique all of a sudden is going to have the capacity to sell to South Africa, as well as buy from South Africa. If South Africa thinks they can just sell to Mozambique, and Mozambique has got nothing to sell to South Africa, tell me what is the difference or what's the benefit in Mozambique buying from South Africa as opposed to buying from China. So skin in the game is the biggest challenge that we have in the architecture of the AfCFTA. If we get that right, then we'll create the resources to enhance the inclusivity that you're talking about, whether it's on a gender basis or age basis, whatever the case may be. But we need to pay particular attention to the architecture of the production side of the AfCFTA.
Thank you very much for that, Nkosana. And actually, my point was exactly this, how you can use the AfCFTA to ensure that there is inclusivity, that there's greater equality on the continent, not so much as a normative aspiration in its own right, not so much that you need the AfCFTA for inclusivity, but I'm glad you cleared up that point. Hannah, your own thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I guess my entry point is slightly different in terms of more from a kind of who is participating in trade. And I think we know that, of course, on the African continent, majority of businesses are businesses are women owned. There is talk of a women's protocol now with regards to the AfCFTA, taking that into account, and especially small and medium enterprises. You know, women are at the center of that economy, and especially the informal economy. Now, it's not a case necessarily of saying, well, we need to get rid of the informal economy. That's not necessary at this stage of our development. It's more a case of how do we leverage the economy? How do we, in the informal economy, how do we leverage the role of women in trade in order to and ensure that the benefits of trade are also going to them as well as others. So I think that is plausible. I think if there is a women's protocol, if there is a stronger emphasis on incorporating small and medium enterprises, making sure benefits go to small and medium enterprises, you almost automatically be targeting women. If we make sure that competition policy, for instance, does not crowd out the informal economy, that's also going to be really useful. And so, yeah, we can find ways, I think, of making sure that in the design of the AfCFTA that it will be helpful in terms of inclusivity. I think it's possible still.
Yes, of course. And I think this is a very important point. Of course, one of the reasons why you have the informal economy is that trade costs are high, relatively high, and people respond in ways in which they can engage in trade at a much lower level of productivity and engagement and so on. And one of the objectives, of course, is to bring trade costs down in order that you could incorporate people into the formal economy. But yes, indeed, I get your point that the AfCFTA needs to respond to these sorts of issues.
E-commerce as well as an important entry point there as well. And again, looking at China, there's some really interesting lessons there, because e-commerce was used as a means to encourage sellers to engage, and sellers who were previously rural sellers, who were previously in the informal economy, classified in the informal economy, they then were engaged in the e-commerce platforms, and they started to trade more. And again, that's something which and in terms of the studies which have been done on the impact that had, you found that it was majority women who engaged. So again, there's possibilities of using a number of these different tools that we have and the protocols that we have in negotiation and in implementation to really focus on ensure inclusivity.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I would like to come back to an issue that you've already raised, and to turn to Nkosana for his thoughts on this, and that is the question of sustainable infrastructure, sustainable logistics, and so on. That these are all, of course, important enablers for the AfCFTA and for trade in general. And we all know that there's a huge deficit on the continent. But again, your thoughts on this question, Nkosana. What do you think needs to be done, in order to overcome this deficit?
Okay, again, we can't get away from the mindset shift issue. So let's look at a few illustrative past examples. Most African countries used to think that governments had to own telecommunications, for instance. And when that was the case, there was a huge bottleneck in terms of resource mobilization to be able to roll out a sensible coverage and therefore create accessibility to the infrastructure for telecommunications. When that changed, because this issue of control, i.e. it's a security risk because of communication and so on. When that shifted and the private sector was allowed to come in, telecoms exploded through the cell phone, as we all know now. Penetration levels reached global levels virtually in terms of communications. I think a lot of our issues are mind issues. It's a wrong perception of what we need to own and control. The minute you allow the private sector, who have actually got the capital to come in, most instances on the African continent, it's not, when you do the analysis, what holds us back, it's not cost. What holds us back is access or availability. And in many instances, actually, we end up paying more for the poorer, pay more to access these resources than the rich countries, which is an oxymoron, if you ask me. We've got it all. So what do we need to do? We need to relax. Relax and stop the madness about wanting to own everything. You don't have to own a road. You don't have to own rail. Let those with the money build them. And they are there. Relax and let people be provided with these services so they can access them. The rollout then gets done by the private sector. You create an environment. Yes, you create a framework of policy and regulation, and they let a toll system, for instance, come into play. You drive, you pay. You go on a train, you pay the appropriate fee. And the people who have got the capital, if they can get a sensible return on it, then they'll build the infrastructure. In the financing, one imaginative thing I personally would suggest, if I run a country, my approach would be the following. I'm not going to pay for the building of a road or rail, but what I will do is I'll provide a floor in terms of investment return. I'll guarantee a certain return to whoever deploys their capital in that sector. But in return, however, I'll also say above a certain return, we are going to share, because I won't allow them to exploit the population unreasonably. This is normal in all markets. So if I guarantee you a minimum return, I've earned the right to also limit your top level return by simply saying then, because of the cost I've incurred in insuring you effectively, we are going to share the returns above a certain level so that it goes back into the public purse. I think it's imagination, how to create the environment and not hold ourselves back by insisting on finding the capital that we don't have, and not those who've got the capital do the financing.
Sure. I think these are very deep thoughts on the political economy of the African state, and need to prioritize efficiency and deal with these issues relating to how capital is accumulated and so on. Hannah, your own thoughts on these aspects that are essential, the overcoming the infrastructure deficit and so on.
Yeah, I fully agree. We need to be more imaginative and creative. We have an infrastructure deficit. It is well known that a financing deficit for infrastructure. Yes, so far we have been, over the last few years at least, been trying to rely on more concessional loans to get there. I think we must continue to go with pushing our partners to support us with concessional loans. But at the same time, that creativity is plausible. I think we can look at a number of different models. What we need to be careful of, however, I think is, in the 80s, we went through structural adjustment where we had a lot of privatization of our enterprises and a lot of privatization of utilities, very basic utilities. And that did not go in poor people's favor in many cases. So we do need to be, while there are some essentials which can, obviously, there are certain essentials which can, non-essentials which are fine for the private sector to really come into. They should be coming into more. I think there's a general problem with risk perception. African risk perception is far too high from the private sector. So we really need to work on kind of pushing those negative risk perceptions of in terms of African investment. But we also, where, for example, utilities are concerned, or things like rail, as long as the government is making sure that the private sector is setting the right optimal price, societal optimal price, for instance, on rail, which will enable consumers to actually use the rail, then there are so many different models that can be used. So we just have to get more complex in all of this. We're going to have more complex economies. The AfCFTA is part of that intensity in creating more complexity. We just have to jump in, really.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I know we're running out of time, but I think there's still time for one last round of questions and exchange on this. And I'd like to come back to an issue that Nkosana raised, and that's the role of dominant economies on the African continent. Again, a very important insight, as we have seen this elsewhere in Southeast Asia. We've seen the role of Japan, of China, and the effect that has had on other countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on. So I think, again, a very strong insight here. Nkosana, you have vast experience of the African continent from a very long career. What do you see as the prospects for Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco stepping into this role that you mentioned?
Well, I think the prospects are good, but there are a few fundamentals which we need to change, and let's not restrict it to those big ones, because the things I'm going to touch on are actually pervasive on our continent side. And maybe let me take a step back and say, these conversations are often problematic for me because a lot of what needs to be said, strictly speaking, is inside conversations as opposed to outside conversations. You should get my drift. We ought to be sitting in a room amongst ourselves and looking at each other and saying, you know what, these are the things we need to change, without feeling that we need to be defensive because an outsider is listening in. Sadly, I'm going to have to treat what should be an inside conversation and expose it to the outside, because that's the world we live in now. There is transparency at all sorts of levels. What is holding us back? There are two primary things that I think the African continent needs to deal with. The first one, sadly, I think is corruption. A lot of resources are wasted. We behave as if we don't have resources. Africa is over-endowed in comparison to many parts of the world with natural resources. And also, actually, interestingly, even with human capital, very bright people on this continent, but we educate them and then we lose them to the rest of the world because we have not created a conducive environment at home to accommodate these people. Doctors, financiers, you just look at what's going on outside there. They're all over the place. We are all over the place. The second one, which is related, is we don't have an appreciation of meritocracy. You know, when Nkosana becomes president of country whatever, he goes and gets his nephew, or his son, his wife, his daughter to do jobs that they are not qualified to do. And as a result, our ability to transform our resources into all of these good things we've been talking about are totally undermined. So I think there are certain fundamentals that we need to confront, uncomfortable as they are, and realize that unless we get this corrected, we can say all we like, as much as we like. And the world now actually is tend to becoming polite and politically correct. They are not going to look us in the face and tell us to change our ways. They'll just listen. They'll own us and give us places to sit at, World Bank, IMF, UN. What quality of people are we sending there? What quality of people are we deploying at home to manage our economies and do the thinking that is necessary for us to achieve the things that Anna has been saying, for instance? I think these are very uncomfortable conversations which, sadly, I have to say we need to confront. If we correct those two things, will go a long way to achieving most of our aspirations.
Yeah. No, I get the point. And Hannah, on the flying geese model, I think we've heard from Nkosana, very challenging, but these sometimes these tough things need to be said. So your take on the flying geese?
So my take, first of all, is so just on the kind of big economies, I think we overemphasize this competition. We really need to get out of this idea that we have a competition between the economies. This is not a zero-sum game. If we're getting to be the third largest economy in the world, this is not zero-sum. We all have to work really hard, and we're all going to win, but we all have to work really hard in doing so, right? Number one. Second of all, I think the other very uncomfortable conversation has to be with our development partners, and we have to ask the difficult, to say the difficult things too. I think a lot of the time when development partners are working with us, they're saying, you need to change for us. You need to do X, Y, and Z. You need to get rid of corruption. You need to get rid of all of these, challenges at the border, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. But in order for them to really support us and work in partnership and real partnership, where you've got serious, equal respect from both sides, we need, for example, on their sides, things like red tape to also be reduced. We have these things, for agricultural products, for example, we've got phytosanitary arrangements, very, very stringent and different in different economies. Why is that? These sorts of issues, we need to be very tough with our development, start to be very tough with our development partners on, and say, well, we need more access to your markets. More access to your markets will also help to grow our markets too. So if you're really in this with us, you need to open up your markets in a stronger way, and especially to our added value products, because that will provide more incentives for us to grow our markets too, not just to be continuing to export all our raw materials to you, or our agricultural products in unprocessed forms to you. We can do that with China equally. Yeah.
Yes,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Develop on Hannah's point. Let's go back to when I'm running a country, my responsibility first and foremost is to my country and my citizens. We used to get annoyed with what Trump said, but Trump actually was just maybe crude in saying the truth. The truth is, as long as there is something called a nation state, the architecture of nation state says the citizens of country X are going to hold their own politicians who they elect to account for the welfare of the citizens of that country, not the country next door. Which means, therefore, if you don't deploy your best talent at that top level, the capacity to negotiate, as you're saying, and you're right, it's a negotiated process. But what is a negotiated process? It means you have to pit your best brains to be able to sit in a contestation, not aggressively at war, but it's a contestation nevertheless. I always tell people that if you want to understand these things, we were listening to the World Trade Organization, former trade organization official here. Mm-hmm. If you watch Europe and the US, the same people, because as you know, people running the US came from Europe. These are the same people. But the number of times they go to court on trade issues just needs to help Africa understand it's a contestation. And you have to pick your best brains rather than saying, you must like me. No, it's not about you liking me. It's about, can we negotiate in contestation and come up with a win-win situation? Put your best brains forward and you'll achieve that.
It's a mindset of confidence. It's a mindset of confidence. We must have that confidence.
Both competence and confidence, but we need competence. Let's not put the wrong people in these places who don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think our time is up, but it's going to be impossible to summarize everything. But just to say that, suddenly I think there have been some very powerful insights on the AfCFTA and the role that it can play as as a game changer in Africa. I think Hannah reminded us about that economic development is the prize, and to keep our eyes on that prize. Nkosana, you reminded us, among other things, about the important role of investment. We touched on the issues of sustainability in this era of green growth. We looked at inclusion, the informal sector, and also we've looked at various aspects of the political economy of the African state. But the overriding message I'm getting from you is that agency is the driver of reform, and African agency can bring about reform. So I'm getting quite an optimistic perspective on the future, that African agency can indeed take the continent where we want it to go, to realize those things that were in the letter to Kwame Nkrumah that Hannah also reminded us about. So, well, thank you so very much for this conversation, which is part of the LSE Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa, Africa-China Conference. And over to you again, Shirley. Thanks.